I'm Anne, 50 years old, and I reside in Norville, a little town. I was so self-conscious about my appearance after having kids that I was terrified to take off my clothes in front of a mirror. Then one day, Mike, a 25-year-old boy, bent over and kissed my stretch marks as if they were the most exquisite thing in the world, like he had ever seen. And while it is odd and sounds like a weird love story, not in a fairy tale fashion, where it begins gently and frequently, and then I have lived in Norville for about 20 years. Therefore, it holds a very important place in my heart. Years. It's a small, peaceful village where you can stroll to the street's edge in within 10 minutes. People can find out who has recently moved in, who is repainting their front door, and whose tree has my house lies at the base of a little hill, and it just budged for the first time in years. I adore the worn white picket and the old wooden porch, even if it's not very pretty. The backyard lemon tree and the fence were my mother's final birthday presents. Never produced something like me. I tried to be kind, but it never really took off. Separated 8 years ago. There were no disagreements or third parties involved. He simply vanished from The jacket he always wore is still hanging in the closet. He lived a modest, almost impolite existence. It remains there like an odorless shadow. I don't wash it, so don't throw it away. Making tea, reading books, and tending to plants have helped me rediscover how to be by myself. I've also learned to accept my aging body, which includes stretch, scars, loose skin, and drooping. I sleep late and no one is waiting. Breasts. I always feel that my own reflection in the mirror is, the most importantly. I heard a clang that morning as I was inspecting the fence. Then, with a gentle curse, I turned to face the house across the street, which had recently undergone renovations. A young man with unkempt hair was tinkering with a toolbox. His face was fading, his clothing was faded, and his hands were smeared in wood dust. I was ready to enter, looking foolish and attempting to appear knowledgeable, when I instantly drew his attention. Without question, he paused amiably and replied, "Hello," grinning. I nodded and said, a little crookedly, "I just moved in yesterday." However, I didn't turn away either, and 3 days later he knocked on my door and said, "Pardon me." I knew. He was lying when I dropped mine. The large tool bag on his back was sufficient to repair 2 homes, but I still gave it to him. Instead of leaving, he sat down on the ice step and peeled an apple with a screwdriver. My name is Mike, and I'm obviously damaging my fence. I didn't respond, but I did smile for the first time. Mike began to be more present, little, and coming from a chest that hadn't breathed so lightly in a long time. From that point on, he avoided the house and spoke little, but he always sat with headphones half up on one side and a cup of black coffee on the balcony at precisely 7 o'clock. I didn't start a strange acoustic songs once, but I ended up listening to music from the other side of the wall. He was surprisingly tolerant while I stood there all day watching him see the wood the incorrect way. One day, I made 2. He accepted, ate and nodded when I brought over a couple of cookies. They were just sweet enough that I didn't say anything. That statement gave me the impression that, even at the age of 50. Although we weren't tight, it eventually became a routine that I knew Mike liked. Pine to oak. Mike was aware that I frequently stayed motionless for too long in front of the lemon tree. After I informed him of my ex-husband. Not much, just a single sentence, leaving his coat and a blank space. Mike sighed quietly and didn't ask any more questions. Perhaps I recall being silent for a long time that day. Not because I was depressed, but because people were at a loss for words, but because I was sitting there for the first time without anyone trying to help me. I didn't believe Mike was attempting to contact me or that I was in love. I simply felt my heart slowly diminishing, becoming less cautious and dry, and I began to leave the door open no more. I'm 50 years old and my name is Anne, and I'm hurrying to put it behind me like previously, and reside in Norville, a small town. After having kids, I was so self-conscious about my appearance that I was fearful of taking off his clothes in front of a mirror. A 25-year-old boy named as though they were the most exquisite. Mike bent over and kissed my stretch marks. Thing that he had ever seen, and it sounded like an odd love tale, not in a fairy tale fashion, where it begins gently and frequently, and then having lived in Norville for almost 20 years, it holds a very unique place in my heart. It's a small, peaceful town where you can stroll in less than 10 minutes to the street's edge, where people are aware of who is repainting their front door, which tree recently budded for the first time in years, and who recently moved in. I adore the old, yet my house at the top of a little hill isn't very lovely. The backyard lemon tree, the worn white picket fence, and the wooden porch. The last birthday gift my mother gave me didn't work out the way I hoped. Kind, but never quite flowered. I got divorced 8 years ago. There were no conflicts. Third person. He simply vanished from my life in a quiet, almost impolite manner. The jacket he always worn, it still sits in the closet. I don't wash it or throw it away. Appears as an odorless shadow. I've rediscovered how to be by myself, brewing tea, reading, and tending to plants. I've also learned to accept my aging body, which includes stretch scars, loose skin, and drooping. I sleep late, and no one is waiting. Breasts. I always feel like my own reflection in the mirror is the most critical, but no one ever says that. That morning I was inspecting the fence when I heard a clang, followed by a low-pitched curse. I glanced over the street. In the newly restored house across the street, a young man with untidy hair was playing using a toolbox. His face was faded, his shirt was worn, and his hands were covered in wood dust. Was acting foolishly while feigning expertise, saying things like, "I was going to go in when I caught his eye." No hesitancy, no questioning, just a nice pause. "Hello," he responded with a smile. "I just moved in yesterday," I said slightly, crookedly, nodding without saying anything. He knocked on my door 3 days later, but I didn't turn away either. "Excuse me, please." I knew he was lying since I dropped mine, and the large tool bag on his back was plenty to mend too. Houses, but he didn't go. Instead, he sat down on the steps and peeled an apple with a screwdriver. I'm Mike, and I'm obviously ruining my barrier. I didn't respond, but I did grin for the first time. A tiny, genuine smile. Mike began to be more present after that, coming from a chest that hadn't breathed so lightly in a long time. Didn't enter the house, didn't say anything, but always sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee at precisely 7 ounces. I didn't strike up a conversation, but I discovered myself with black coffee and headphones half open on one side. Strange acoustic. Tunes played on the other side of the wall once. He was surprisingly tolerant while I stood there all day watching him see the wood the incorrect way. One day I made 2. I brought over several cookies, and he received them without a word. Nodding. Just nice enough, that statement gave me the impression that I could be exactly right. We weren't even near 50, but it grew over time to become a Mike was aware of my tendency to stand motionless for extended periods of time and that I favored pine to oak. I once informed him about my ex-husband in front of the lemon tree, but not much more than he left his coat in one sentence, leaving a gaping hole that no words could cover. Mike didn't inquire. No further queries, just a quiet sigh, perhaps because they are unsure of what to say to remain. I recall being quiet for a while that day, not because I'm sad, but for the first time. I just sat there without anyone trying to help me. I felt my heart a little bit there, but I didn't think I was in love, or that Mike was attempting to get close. I started leaving the door ajar, and I started to shrink a little less cautiously and dryly. No longer hurrying to put everything behind. Me as I used to. I have an odd behavior that Mike frequently observes at midday when I'm standing beneath the lemon tree in the backyard as the sun slants down, hand on its trunk, as though it were hearing a freshly awakened person's heartbeat. Recovering from a protracted slumber, I planted that lemon tree over 10 years ago. When I turned 40, my mother presented it to me and placed a tiny ball of dirt in my hand. Lemons are difficult to grow, but if they produce fruit, you have... I didn't understand how a tree could measure that, but the more I lived. As time went on, I came to see that my mother was correct. My lemon tree was tall, had a broad canopy and few leaves, but the tough bark was green, and some of it peeled off like my skin every winter. Mike stood beside the fence, leaning his chin on his hand, staring at me with intense attention. It had never blossomed or produced fruit. The tree isn't very healthy. I said quietly, "It's alive," without looking at him. "It simply doesn't provide results, so why do you maintain it?" I looked around, not dejected, but thoughtful, because it's still there, Mike. Was quiet for a while before saying, "I believe it might not flower because no one dares to speak to it." I chuckled quietly, although I was actually speaking to wood. Mike swiftly said, "Teasing wood doesn't have a chance to come back to life." That day, Mike approached without requesting permission, because trees do. He simply carried a book about plants and opened a few pages while feigning civility, and demonstrated to me that people believe lemons should prune their old branches, so that new I nodded. But I was anxious not to touch the scissors since shoots can grow. I was worried that the tree would hurt, but I was also worried that it wouldn't be useful if I chopped it. In that case, I would have. There was nothing left to hope for. As I lay there that night, I reflected on how many items I had preserved but no longer needed. An antique garment that no one had worn in a wedding photo, and a lemon tree without fruit meticulously kept in a moldy drawer. But I decided not to keep them, since I felt bad about save them, since they were the only proof that I had something to lose. The following day, I used the scissors to... "Are you really going to do it?" questioned Garden Mike as he was cleaning the balcony. And I nodded no. Saying anything, my hands began to cut slowly, and every time I pulled, a click sound was produced. Felt someone was erasing a piece of my memories. After I was done, I sat down on the floor and sighed deeply, Mike. He simply put his palm on his heart from a distance and turned to face the lemon tree as though he were bowing to an elderly person without saying anything. Creature attempting to resuscitate, I chuckled once more. Not because Mike is foolish, but since I might have severed a stubborn piece of my heart. In Norville, people don't ask direct questions, but they have another method of showing concern. They glance with curious eyes, apprehensive eyes, and the worst, looks. Things are demeaning and pathetic, like poor thing old, and I'm still not foolish enough to overlook it. Since Mike began frequenting my garden, I've been able to view Mrs. Lorene's eyes, which she tends to water the plants in the afternoon and looks over more frequently. I'm not sure what I did, but I used to teach literature in middle schools and enjoyed commenting on signs of contemporary decadence. When I once went to the market to buy bread, there were 2 women there, but I'm sure it's not a sign of decency. Stating loudly, the older ladies are really playful, while standing close to the fruit cart without mentioning their names. These days. Well, you should have some neighborly love if you're tired of being alone, I mocked. Inside, not because it was painful, but because I had heard more than I had previously believed. I was accustomed to being misinterpreted, but when it triggers a just-emerged feeling in my... That day, I went home silently without calling Mike, and my heart still hurts. He was already enjoying a cold cup of coffee on the porch, as I normally did, when he noticed me. "Are you okay?" I responded, nodding but avoiding eye contact. Mike stopped asking, but later in the afternoon he knocked on my door and gave me an old book with a message pinned on the first page but no author. Rumors are often disseminated. I looked up at him, and Mike grinned. I'm not sure about things they don't understand. Attempting self-defense. Simply put, if someone says anything that offends you. I chuckled quietly, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to be the one to help you forget it more quickly. I need to explain how I feel to a young person. The following day, I purposefully watered the plants later than normal. I noticed Lorene grinning as she watered the plants, and my lemon tree appeared to be blooming once more. I didn't respond. I simply looked, filled the vase with more water, turned, and left without bending my head. Because I was beginning to believe in myself once more, regardless of whether she agreed with me. I'm not the kind of person who gets upset easily. I've learned to avoid being too joyful or too sad after living alone for so long, and not having high hopes for anything that may unintentionally fall away. But suddenly, like a parched leaf, on my sometimes, despite my best efforts, I am unable to shoulder in a strong breeze. Stay cool now. I can't recall that Mike and I were repairing the fence that morning. Who invited whom? Perhaps he asked me, and I pretended to borrow the saw. Mike went up the ladder to close the latch while I waited there clutching the wooden bar. I warned him. Be careful. I chuckled as well. The ladder is very old. You've had it for 10 years. A slight crack. The ladder broke in the middle before I could yell. I only remember lying on my back when Mike slipped and fell directly on me. I can't recall what happened in the first second. Back Mike on top of me, one hand against my cheek, and a shocked, wide-eyed gaze, and I held my breath as if I were 18 once again. We lay motionless for around 3 seconds. It seemed like a slow-motion movie, and I could see Mike's face up close, sufficient to observe the tiny drop of perspiration beneath his chin, the thin hair across his forehead, and the confused fear in his eyes. Not because he was terrified of suffering, but rather because he was, I apologize. I was concerned I would, misread Mike's stuttering attempt to get to his feet, shouted hastily, It's okay. However, he slid his elbow trying to lift himself up, and this time he collapsed. The typical acceptable distance between our lips was exceeded, and my nose was nearly. My heart was beating erratically and unstably when I touched his neck. Unpredictable. Mike reached out to lift me up after he got up, but my hand was still trembling a little for some reason. Both of us exchanged uncomfortable smiles, the kind that didn't nod of whether to feel thankful or ashamed. Next time, let me climb up alone, Mike urged, massaging the eye knotted at the back of his neck. I'll stand a bit more away the next time, but we both Mike didn't come over that afternoon, and neither did I cross the fence, indicating that what had recently transpired was more than a simple tumble. Both appeared to have implicitly consented to break the quiet between the two tiny homes so that our emotions could slow down, I thought, as I sat at the dining table in front of a dish of food that was slowly becoming cold. What happened this morning? I wasn't a 20-something female, and I didn't have the illusion I thought a fall might lead to love, but I couldn't deny it at the time. A gentle fall occurred inside of me, but actually, I switched on the porch light later than normal that evening, as though I was waiting for someone to switch on the opposite side's light, and then precisely at 9:05 p.m. Mike sat motionless with a black coffee and switched on the balcony light, still wearing headphones, but instead of gazing up at the sky this time, while they were observing my porch, I sat there without turning away or grinning, hands around my ginger teacup, staring back. No one said anything yet. After acknowledging something, Mike knocked on the door the following morning and brought a new ladder. Would you dare to ascend once more once I switched the ladder, he said, holding the hammer while grinning hazily. I took the initiative to say, go up, and close the last few bolts to make sure I'll hold, for the first time. Mike nodded, but he turned when he got to the third step and said, but don't stand too near. I'm not. I chuckled, and my heart skipped another beat as I prepared to tumble a second time. I can't recall the precise moment it began, but I do recall that it was a somewhat cloudy afternoon with clouds like when Mike yelled over the fence. I was making tea and had covered the porch with cotton crumbs. I had prepared almond cookies. Would you? I nodded without thinking. I'd like to try them. A little later, Mike brought over 2 cookies on a white enamel dish, and I asked him to have a seat. At the time, I assumed it was usual and didn't really think much of it. For 2 individuals to share a plate of cookies while sitting side by side on a wooden chair on the porch, much like 2 friends Mike told me about his mother on a slow day. Neighbors are like little bits of tranquility. I giggled when Mike mentioned that lonely individuals are frequently skilled bakers. You've been living alone for a long time, so you stared at me with an odd expression. I asked again, and your cookies are just right. Not too much, not too little. I didn't respond because Mike's hand was touching mine at that same time. Are you praising or criticizing? What do you think? Very gently, as though to see if I would retreat, but I didn't, and we sat in silence for a while. The wind Mike reached out to touch a strand of hair as it blew gently through my hair, and I could see a few silver strands showing. He delicately touched my forehead as though he was worried about hurting it, then he cocked his head. The separation between our faces squinted, and I paused before Mike kissed me lightly without asking. His lips brushed mine in a gesture of welcome that was neither hurried nor forced. He would stay a little while longer if I allowed him to. I allowed it to sit there for a few seconds before pulling away without becoming alarmed. Quietly, she stated, "I need some time, Mike," as though to remind us both that we were still in a state of flux. Was not let down. Instead of trying more, he simply nodded. I understand. Got up, moved carefully, and stopped briefly on the stairs if you didn't want to. Let it be a kiss that nobody remembers. But if you do, I recall that I was unable to fall asleep. That evening, not because of the kiss, but rather because of the hazy desire it evoked, which I believed I had placed a long time ago, I stepped before the mirror and examined myself. It was still the same crow's feet at the corners of my eyes and the same shoulder. The same 50-year-old Anne with the thick and somewhat tanned wrists, layers of protection. But for the first time, I questioned whether I had the authority to begin something, even if it's from someone who is half a lifetime younger than me. Mike was still seated the following morning. On the balcony, I brought a cup of coffee and headphones, and the expression in his eyes as he glanced at me warmed. Up. This time, I added a little sweetness to the ginger tea to make up for. Mike grinned at the somewhat unexpected kiss last night. If I had known, I would have kissed him earlier. I gave him a slight scowl, but something inside of me blossomed. I'm not sure when I first became afraid of light. Not daylight, but the light from a yellow lamp in a closed space where my after-giving delivery, my nude body was exposed, and I used to gaze in the mirror, not counting the damage. I could see that there were stretch marks down my ancient pottery had stomach-like cracks, and areas where the skin was wrinkly and drooped like a piece of cloth. That had decreased. My hips were broad. My back, my breasts were no longer plump. Had some black places, but I never dared to believe that. I learned to accept that someone would want to kiss it. Mike stayed up late that night, and we spoke more. Then, typical of our early years, the terrible thing I regret most about my 20s meal I've ever prepared. At one point, I burned a whole pot of black bean porridge because I smiled while I overslept. But on the inside, I felt lighter than ever. Then he asked if I wanted to. Would you allow me to touch you out of love, not curiosity? I was quiet After a long moment, I nodded gently, and Mike extended his fingers without hurrying, caressed my shoulder tenderly and without desire, which made me feel I didn't stop him when his hand went to my neck, and then to the first button of my shirt. But I halted when he felt the stretch mark beneath my belly, and swiftly yanked his hand away. I took a step back and didn't look straight at Mike, covering my shirt. "No, it's not pretty," he murmured. "I didn't come to," as he stood there without moving or being alarmed. I stayed for the genuine things, and nothing is more genuine than finding the ideal beauty. Compared to the markings left by time, I clutched my sleeve and coughed. "You're unaware of these stretch marks, were they? What kept you alive was the child you carried inside, nurtured and expelled. You think, that's bad." I turned away, but I couldn't stop the tears from streaming down my face. "Stop them, Mike. You don't have to show me." He just sat down next to me and put his hand on my back. I put my head on his shoulder, and he added, "Just know that you're the most beautiful because you're not hiding." I allowed someone to contact me for the first time, not just with their hands, but also by observing me like I were a story worth hearing. That evening, instead of curling up as I always did, I turned to the side. "This body isn't broken. It's just gone through," I muttered loud enough for myself to hear where the moonlight was. Too much love and loss. With my hands still wet from showering, I discovered the envelope in the mailbox early one Monday morning. The leaves weren't fragrant. It was just a folded sheet of paper without my name on it. Half in big letters. "A young man and an elderly woman flirting won't end well." No signature or other words, yet it was sufficient to tighten my heart like, though someone had I stood there for a while, just squeezing it in the center of my chest. It felt like someone had just torn me apart with their gaze along the fence. Not because of what was said in the letter, but because I was certain it came from a close friend, not a complete stranger. While walking the dog, someone who lived nearby waved to me. Someone who told me I kept the house and who had borrowed pruning shears I kept it a secret from Mike, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want him to get upset and was worried he might believe I was a troublemaker, and I was worried that Mike would decide to leave if he found out. I concealed the letter in the kitchen drawer, since there's no justification for enduring the resentment of a hostile town. I told myself it was only a joke, just once, next to the napkins. But it wasn't the last time. At 2:01 a.m., 3 days later, I heard a commotion in the backyard. Leaping to my feet without turning on the light, I tiptoed to the back door and noticed I didn't pursue the shadowy figure that flashed by and vanished behind the fence. Instead, I just stood there I felt a mix of pain, rage, and terror, because I realized this individual could have said something pleasant to me during the day, and I was stunned when I strolled out into the backyard the following morning. My lemon. I recently pruned the tree that I had nursed for almost a decade, but it had never produced any fruit. Hoped for, it was cut across the trunk with a saw, not uprooted, and it was clean and decisive. Chilly, I bent over and touched the lemon tree trunk, which was still dripping with sap. Mike saw me late that day, and even though I didn't cry, my fingers shook like never before. Approached while I was still seated in the center of the yard, speechless. He glanced at the tree without asking. Anything just sat down beside me, his dark eyes asking softly, "Why?" I didn't. I just took it out of my pocket and gave him the old piece of paper that I still had. "Mike." He tightened his fist and asked, "Do you know anyone?" I shook my head, finding that nobody was clear. Place. Until they dislike something, everyone can. Be a good person, Mike. Folded the paper and fixed the tree. It might not live, but I'll get. When I looked at him again, I saw a young guy who, for the first time in my life, 3 days after Mike put the tree back up, he buried the lemon root deep in the ground and dared to touch my suffering without looking away. "There is hope as long as there are roots," he replied, attaching it to the stake with a rope. I didn't say anything. I simply gave it regular morning watering. I had no hopes, but I also didn't feel hopeless because I knew that someone was holding my heart without passing judgment, even if the tree didn't return back to life. I used to store my wedding picture in my closet's bottom drawer, which is the most private and least touched spot. photographed on a bright day with my hair tied up high and wearing a white lace dress. I smiled shyly, as though I was terrified of the joy I was going to experience with the man. My ex-husband was standing by me, holding me with both hands, but his eyes weren't on me. Instead, they were on after the lemon tree was felled. He could have wished to go there even before our wedding day. I felt as though I was standing between two universes when the anonymous letter appeared. Mike was gently touched on one side of the present, while on the other side was the dust-covered but never completely open that evening while Mike was cleaning. I unlocked the bottom drawer of the broom on the porch and removed the picture without, trembling, yet my heart was racing like Mike watched me leave with the question, "Is there anyone patient enough to listen to a woman tell an old story?" He took the picture without asking, glanced at it, and then remarked, "You and the you look a little terrified, but the photos are lovely." I hesitated, fearing what I inquired. "I'm not sure, maybe afraid that I can't keep something so big." I was sitting. "You're correct," he said. I wasn't sure I was strong enough to be anyone's wife back then, but I got married because Mike listened and didn't interrupt me when I said, "I thought love was enough." He wasn't unattractive, he didn't cheat, yet he simply vanished like a sun-fading photograph. I informed her that marriage was still there, like a hard piece of paper, and that love had faded by the time I noticed it. Regarding the birth of my kid, how I gave birth by myself while my spouse was occupied, and how I looked in the 3 months after giving birth, I started to get used to not being able to recognize my body in the mirror. Touched, but only a portion of the house, such as the gas stove, is viewed with desire. The old bedding I once claimed to be wearing a new dress while standing in the center of the home. And he passed by, and Mike was quiet for a while before he asked, "You know I don't like blue." And then I removed it because I didn't want to, not to get his approval. I looked at Mike because I was exhausted. You see, sometimes apathy doesn't arrive. Shouting is a sign that people no longer think you're worth their money. "You don't know what the girl in the photo has been through, but," Mike said, as he handed the picture back to me. "Strong and breathing like a tree that has never stopped, she is sitting next to me today. Been uprooted." I grinned. It wasn't a fancy phrase, but it felt like an arm in the right spot. I burnt the wedding picture that night, not because I was angry, but because I was hurting where I had been hurting for 10 years. Mike didn't say anything when he saw me, because he understood I didn't need to maintain something that had never been the beginning. When the fire subsided and the ashes had dispersed, he simply watched and assisted in blowing on it, turned to face him and said, "It turns out that some histories aren't in the picture. They're in how Mike nodded and said, 'You think we don't repeat the same thing again? Need pictures to finish the story, correct?' I nodded slowly and steadily, as I think I deserve a fresh beginning, not one that starts with regret, and I'm having trouble sleeping, not because of the automobiles, not due to any specific melancholy or dreams. Some nights are not cold, but I can't close my eyes once I open them. I feel as though I'm living at a level, not hungry, but filled with a soft emptiness. I put on an old sweater and step out onto the porch, my heart a little lower than before. The town retires to bed more, and Norville is asleep by 2:13 a.m. More on time than a hospital. I take a seat on the stairs as the night breeze passes by. Even though it doesn't shake the trees, it's enough to bring back memories of the evenings I spent by myself after I was accustomed to divorce when the girl left for college, and after my mother passed away. But that doesn't mean I'm not depressed. I switch Mike's balcony light on, and a little click sounds. After a few seconds, he came out with his hair unkempt and a light coat on. He held a glass of water and simply stared at me without saying hello. I raised my eyebrow, realizing that Mike was also having trouble sleeping. Nightmares. He shook. "No, it's only that on some nights, I can't stop wondering what about anything." But Mike gave me a quiet look that said, "If I'm not truly alone when someone else is awake." So I fell silent and held my cup of tea. I glanced at him, and there were just 2 white chrysanthemum bushes in the distance, touching, Kissing and lying close to each other used to be my idea of intimacy. But that night, I discovered there is an even greater closeness when two people sit on opposite sides of a fence and remain silent, but still feel heard. "Do you want me to sit on?" The Mike inquired, pointing to my porch chair, and I gave him a very quiet nod. Went silently around the gate, and when he sat down, my heart became as peaceful as a lake rippling in the wind. No one spoke. On a night when there was nothing to do, we simply sat like that together. Mike rested his head back on the chair, feeling depressed, but not sufficiently happy. "Do you see anything?" "I don't see anything, perhaps." His eyes are fixed on the sky. "You're not used to looking up." I chuckled quietly. He was correct. I was not accustomed to tilting my head back, opening my heart, and staring down at the grass, the ground, and the roots. After some time, Mike said, "There's something I haven't told you." I thought something was waiting up there. When I was little, I used to fantasize that I lived somewhere unknown. Every day, I would pass wooden gates and say hello to strangers, and at the end of the day, there was a person who consistently left the porch without asking me anything. I turned to face him with the light on, and Mike grinned. I'm not dreaming anymore. I didn't respond there, but I knew that if I slept tonight, it wouldn't be felt exhausted. It would be because I was no longer alone in a house with dwindling lights, which surprised me. I watered the lemon tree every morning as a way to help it come back to life. Not out of hope, but more because I was accustomed to taking care of things. Even I observed a little, pale sprout that morning when I leaned over to the base's edge, even though I knew it wouldn't react. It was so green that it was nearly translucent, but it was emerging from the arid ground, obstinately quiet, as though to say, I'm still here. I haven't let go. I remained motionless for nearly a minute without breathing, and then I bent over and touched it with 2 fingers as though I were touching I didn't cry, but I felt like a frail creature who had just returned from another realm. I told Mike that I had heard something inside of me crack. Not a crack, but something that hadn't opened its lid in a long time. Afternoon, he hurried over like a kid chasing candy as soon as he heard it, and we both peered down at the sprout. Mike grinned warmly, seeing that it was only waiting a little while my eyes were still wet. Bravery of the caregiver, I chuckled, but this time I burst out laughing. It had been I hadn't laughed like that in a long time. Not the forced laugh I shared with my neighbors, nor the chuckle I had to get over an issue. And it wasn't just a courteous chuckle. Rather, it was a loud, direct laugh that came out of my chest. Mike, who had just released a burden, glanced at me with a look of amazement on his face. Why do you think that's odd? Because you laugh like a 25-year-old. I pouted at you, just because I laughed. Claimed that because the lemon tree resurrected. But I actually claimed that, because you did. That evening, I went to bed early since I didn't have time to wait for Mike's lights to come on. I lay in bed with my hand on my chest and listened to my heart beat steadily, wondering if he had missed me. But nevertheless, warm. Not from my skin, but from something inside of me that agreed to start anew. The following day, I cleared the balcony of broken chairs and extra dead potted plants. I laid a new rug with the intention of fixing old paint cans that I no longer needed. For the first time in years, I penned a line in my journal, put 2 seats back, and prepared tea. Mike arrived at lunchtime with an old notepad on the day the lemon tree sprouted, and I stopped covering my smile. He brought saying, "Put it next to the lemon tree for company." A little pot of orchids took it, placed it next to the tree, and whispered, "Now I'm scared it will die since I know certain things only survive if you have the courage to think they deserve to." Mike. They regarded me as though I had just finished reciting a poem, even though I knew I hadn't. That night, I sat on the porch once more and was just reciting something I had learned from a fallen tree. Not anticipating, not waiting, simply sitting. And if someone happened to catch me grinning, it was all right, because I now understood that smiling is not for other people to see, but rather for hearing that I am still alive, even though it happened without a plan or a torch. Without any music playing prior, but due to an unusually heavy downpour, a soggy afternoon saw a sigh between Mike and me, who were no longer willing to keep anything from each other. When the rain started to pour, I was drinking tea on the porch. It wasn't heavy, but it was thick, so I got up and started to gather. Mike took hold of my hand and let me handle the hanging wash. He left with his clothing still soaking and gathered them up swiftly, them into the basket. When he turned around, his hair was stuck to his forehead and his body was soaked, and he smiled like I inadvertently gave a towel to a kid who had just won a practical joke. But instead of wiping his face, he stared at. His eyes didn't inquire, but I didn't resist when his hand softly drew me in. Taking a step back, we shared a kiss in the dim porch light. The scent of rain and moist clothing, the scent of damp hair and ginger tea combined to create I couldn't identify the unusual sensation. All I knew was that I simply breathed when Mike's lips touched my neck. "Are you certain Mike didn't respond?" He gave me a long, gentle hug. The embrace seemed to have been stored in my heart for a while and was finally ready to be let go. We went to my house. We held hands and stared at each other without saying a word, guiding one another into the space where I used to be alone with my pillow. I expected to feel uncomfortable, but yet I felt pleasantly at ease because I knew who should see. Mike was the one who had once stooped to revive a half-cut tree after all the ups and downs in my body. I removed my shirt when his hands contacted my belly, but not in a rush. I instinctively turned slightly where the stretch marks resembled a faint map of a birthing journey. He put his touch there. On my cheek. "Don't turn away so I can see you for who you truly are." I swallowed. He gazed directly into my eyes, and Mike kissed me for the first time without me hiding. No forced praise, no meaningless words of consolation, simply a very genuine quiet, as though he were reading an ancient book, with each page longing to turn every sentence despite its worn corners. We made love slowly and deliberately, unlike in movies or in my dreams. I assumed that there would be no music or groans, just breathing and genuine handshakes. I felt ashamed, but rather, I felt tenderly held, not only by hands. That was unnecessary. After that, Mike sketched circles on my body while we slept side by side. Placing his index finger to his shoulder blades, he remarked, "You know, I used to believe being nice was a gesture, but I now realize that it's a decision, and you've been strong for so long that I've decided to treat you gently." I turned to face him and said nothing, but I knew in my heart that this was more than simply an intimate moment, because it was the first time I had ever allowed someone to touch my most vulnerable area. And I'm still awake, not because of the birds or the alarm clock. Mike was asleep next to me, though, since I could hear his steady breathing. His arm was remained across my stomach. It wasn't a particularly tidy position, but I felt so at ease that I stayed motionless, simply listening to the presence of someone else who has the same life rhythm in the space that once contained just my uneasy sleep and the sound of the ceiling fan were interrupted by the soft, dim morning light streaming in through the window. I turned softly and got to my feet, feeling like a warm towel laid on the forehead of someone who has just recovered from an illness. I stopped briefly as I passed the mirror, after carefully drawing the curtain to prevent him from being awakened by the light. Even though my body still had all the signs of the years. For the first time I looked at it for a long time, without feeling guilty. As though it had just, after being tenderly touched by actual eyes, I put on my coat and stepped outside into the yard where the sky was still moist. The ground seemed softer, and the air smelled of dirt after last night's rain, as though everything was whispering something that only those standing for a long enough period of time could hear, and then I noticed it on the lemon tree's trunk. Exactly where it was cut, a new shoot appeared. Not the butt at the base nor the side branches, but directly in the center of the ancient wound, as though it had been injured most severely first. Sprout fresh life. I knelt down and stared for a while without touching. Hurt a little, not because I was depressed, but rather because I felt like I belonged. Imagine that I am the rootless bear that was brutally injured by the lemon tree. But I felt more like it than ever before. Mike left a few minutes later, his hair still untidy, because I might still grow from an old wound. When he noticed me bending over the tree, he took his jacket off his shoulder and came over to point out Mike's eyes lowered down. He brightened like a kid witnessing a wonder in a glass container, and you can tell that he grinned. I looked at him and realized that all he needed was time and a little faith. Mike took my hand in the center of the garden and said, "It just needs someone to keep it alive until it can come back to life." We stood motionless in front of a freshly blossomed bud in the early morning. There was no need to add anything, more because it appeared like the lemon tree had already stated everything that needed to be said. I used to believe that I would laugh if someone asked me to marry them at the age of 50, due to the fact that they believed it to be a joke laugh since I had forgotten to think that genuine love could start after youth. But Mike didn't pop the question with roses or a dinner party or a ring. He just stated, one fairly typical morning, while I was leaning on the kitchen counter, he turned a cup of hot tea and said, "I was thinking about cutting lemon peels for tea. That, if it's okay with you, we might consider it a bit further." I glanced up at the knife in my palm, stumbling. "How far is that?" "As cohabitating for some time. Let's see. No commitments, but not uninterested." I laid down the knife and laughed, not in a derisive way, but rather, "Oh, so that can laugh." Mike gave me a slightly anxious expression, "But if you see it soon, I can wait. If you want, don't bring it up again." I shook my head, saying, "Not soon. I assumed you were sincere. I don't know how to be sincere besides wanting to live with someone." There was a long break during which the birds could be heard, followed by another round of laughter and stillness. "I had a husband," I added quietly, "and the tea in my cup was growing cold outdoors. Was with someone, Mike, and I felt as alone as though I were sleeping in a place that I had rented." "I don't want to be in a house," he said, putting his hands on the back of the chair and staring at me. "Once more, I have to speculate as to what the other person is thinking or remain vigilant to keep them safe, Mike." Nodded. "That's not what I want either. If you agree, we'll live together instead, attempting to be someone else. You are you, I am me, and we just must be honest with each other." I gave him a slow glance, not to think, but to capture the moment. I nodded when the most mature person I'd ever seen sat in front of me and was half my life younger than me, large but certain. That evening, Mike brought over a bag of clothes, a crate of books, and an old guitar. But instead of packing them immediately, he placed them in the corner of, "I'll clean up tomorrow, but today I just want to have a little relaxation," the living room then replied. "Dinner with you at a home that isn't a one-person residence anymore." I prepared a straightforward dish of white rice and fried eggs. We both ate the vegetable soup as though we had been eating it for years. Following the Mike scrubbed the table, I washed the dishes, and there was simply the sound of water. No one discussed plans or the future. Occasionally, there is a very faint laugh that sounds like it comes from two people who are aware that they are not in a mic. When love doesn't have to sprint, it will have enough time to develop before falling asleep. I questioned, "What?" "Tomorrow I will plant another tree next to the lemon tree." "Tree?" "A friend I shook my hand to, a tangerine tree beside the lemon tree. A pair tangerines and lemons are both sour, and two sour items are positioned next to each other." Mike grinned. "Are they compatible?" "At least they don't feel too uncomfortable." I didn't think I would see him again because I believed the past was far away, not because it hurt too much. Far enough that I would never return, But that morning, while I was watering the lemon tree, which now had 3 new leaves, a strange car pulled up in front of the gate, and when the window rolled down, I recognized the face as a rewinding his memory. He spoke in a calm, quiet voice that was familiar. Courtesy, I was walking past and noticed the house, so I paused and remained motionless for a second. I wasn't upset or joyful. It was just... My thought was trying to figure out whether I should act like an elderly person or like someone else when I entered. I said quietly, didn't offer tea or strike up a conversation. Instead, choosing to sit in a chair I asked, "How are you?" as he sat across from me on the porch. The space prevented me from feeling claustrophobic. He glanced around the garden and said, "It's okay." So I nodded. A couple additional things. The lemon tree is still there, but it has regrown. I believed I was dead when he grew silent, and his eyes lingered on the new leaves. He sighed quietly, after a time too, and I returned here without making things worse. Even worse, I feel like I owe you a favor, because I knew what was going on but didn't respond. Coming, and I apologize. At the time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear it. I didn't say anything, but I put my hands together and made you invisible in your own home. I know there are no words, but I accept responsibility if you are ever injured. And I looked him in the eyes without harboring any anger or avoiding him. Didn't shatter me, but we both didn't know how to stay together. I nodded for the first time in a long time. Yes, but not because I thought you were harmed. I believed there was nothing left for me to stay, so you departed, but he bent his. I smiled, not in a forgiving way, but in a way that said, "Are you okay now?" A 25-year-old man is growing tangerines here, and he's smiling a little. He grinned warmly. You deserve it. It feels like I'm having a bit of a sweet and sour time in my life next to the lemon tree. Before departing, he inquired, "Would you choose to go back in time to that day?" I stared at him for a while before shaking my head and saying no, not because I used to believe that love was sufficient, but now I realize that love is insufficient. Thus, you're awful. He nodded and got up without touching me, saying, "The truth is the only thing that can keep anyone." He just stated, "I hope you continue to live the way you are, beautiful and without trying to ask for anything more. Enough." I got up and held the unbrewed teapot in place when his car was out of sight. Mike was standing quietly in the kitchen as I entered the house with my hand. "Is he?" I nodded and asked, "Are you okay?" I paused for a moment before he spoke. Honestly, I'm not furious anymore, but I'm also not forgiven yet. It's simply that there are. Mike nodded, saying, "I apologize at the end, not to erase the past, but to confirm that we have overcome it." Inquiries. He simply poured tea, and we drank it together. He didn't say anything else, but I knew Mike was constantly present and helping me fulfill an incomplete forgiveness by going out of his way to screw. It was a slightly sunny morning when I went outside with 2 glasses of cool water and the final screws for the wooden fence. The backyard trees were rustling due to the wind, and the ground was still wet from the previous night's rain. I watched his back still while leaning on the door frame like a July whisper. "What piece is coming off this time?" I inquired, feeling young, strong, and yet comforting in a very genuine way. Mike smiled, half joking, and turned his head, his perspiration delicately stroking his forehead. Brightly, "I'm not going to fix the dismantling today." I moved closer to touch this fence and set the glass of water on the brick wall's edge. I scowled as I disassembled it. Mike acknowledged that to a certain extent, I don't want it standing here anymore, thus desire nothing to stand between your home and mine. I remained silent for a few moments, gazing Mike fixes the gray wooden slats once a week, hammering each nail 3 times before turning back to observe him. And he nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "If you agree, we may begin considering living together instead of in separate houses." I wasn't as shocked as I had anticipated, because we were housed next to each other but under the same roof. In fact, a part of me had been waiting for the offer, not because I lacked anything, but because I was sufficiently, I feel I could reestablish a strong relationship with someone without having to worry about it. "Are you sure?" I questioned, despite the storm breaking, and Mike nodded without trepidation. "You don't have to change anything. We just need to be honest with ourselves, just like we've always been." Therefore, that morning, we removed the fence rather than repairing it quickly, not loudly, gently, bar by bar, as we were taking apart the last of the gaps between my barriers and the layers of anxiety that had been adhered to me using disappointment as glue. The two houses parted, creating a space rather than a border. There was a porch with 2 seats and a communal yard where people could have breakfast together. Mike spreads a cloth on the lawn every morning and places a tea table with 2 glasses. He promised to add some more lavender shrubs and some stones to the little orchid container next to the lemon tree. The walkway between the 2 doors is for 2 persons, not 2 guests. Living together, he constructed the first wooden structure, in the afternoon, which resembled a drawing for a porch that would eventually take shape. Even though it's not a house yet, it will serve as a haven for us to hide from the eye, stared at the frame hanging in the sun, wondering if it wasn't living. With someone who opened my heart was what I was most terrified about. What if the house would be abandoned one day as though someone had suddenly taken away all the warmth? But then I realized that my fear of not being able to defend myself was what kept me alive. Mike took a seat beside me beneath the lemon tree, which was still there, because I didn't want to live without it any longer. Every morning, the fresh leaves continued to unfold, so I turned to face him and inquired, Are you in a rush?" He smiled and shook his head, saying, "Have you forgotten that I came here to stay, not to run?" Gently, yet firmly in his hand. And for the first time in a long time, I was only concerned with what would be retained, not what I would lose. Promises, but via modest deeds, no barriers are required. Just someone I pulled out my notebook at the end of the day and penned a single line. Who knew how to help me rebuild the roof? On the same day that the fence was taken down, the foundation for a house was poured. Despite I didn't think my life would have any more happy chapters after the age of 50, because there was already someone in it and there was no plan. Actually, I thought that the tight skin, slender waist, and fleeting kisses were gone, along with the nicest things. When the kids were calling for their moms outside the door after school, I used to believe that the rest was just upkeep. The cell lemon tree is sufficient to endure without sadness or joy, grew once more. A fresh shoot appeared where it had been sliced, and a young A-man came through the wooden fence to stand beside me and to help me take it down so that we could be together. There wouldn't be any separation, and I regained my ability to laugh. A woman who was desired but not a mother, an ex-wife, or a decent neighbor. I don't go back to live like I'm 25. Instead, I live like I'm 50 so they could be with me without needing to show anything, with all the layers of time's cracks and the profoundly broken quiet. But now, I have a partner that never leaves after kissing each of those markings. I adore it. It turns out that being the youngest does not make you the most luminous. Rather, it does when you lose faith in it. Gently, but patiently taps on the door. If you're still hearing this, perhaps you've been holding something inside of you. It could be an unnamed wound or a tiny hope that hasn't been watered. Regardless of your age or the experiences you've had, remember that you are still worthy of love. You don't have to be flawless again. Rekindle your youth by being authentic and believing in yourself. One day someone will decide to stay. I sincerely appreciate you listening to my tale of Anne, a regular woman with a young boyfriend and a lemon tree near Norrell. I hope your heart has just been touched, even though the story is done. Open to some compassion. Please subscribe to The Daily if this story touches you in some way. Unexpected Stories channel, so that you can hear a brief story each week that doesn't loud, not showy, but sufficient to make you feel cozy in this fast-paced world. you appear in yet another surprising narrative every day.